What transpired with your partner this afternoon was unexpected. Don't pass up this tale. Your soulmate's afternoon was softly interrupted by something that appeared normal to everyone else until a single, fleeting moment made it clear that it was anything but. There was only a brief pause, a glance that lingered a second too long, and an inexplicable feeling instead of a loud declaration or a dramatic arrival. None of the events that followed would have occurred if they had left 30 seconds earlier. However, they didn't. They remained. And that one choice started telling a tale that neither of you could have predicted this morning. This afternoon contains a secret tidbit that alters the meaning of everything you're going to hear. Therefore, don't go away just yet because the biggest surprises are frequently found in the tiniest moments. As people rushed through yet another ordinary day, the afternoon sun gently touched the walkways. Automobiles moved. Discussions faded into the background. Coffee mugs were exchanged. Nothing seemed out of the ordinary. However, your partner seemed oddly preoccupied, as though an unseen question followed them around. They had no idea why familiar locations felt so strange all of a sudden. They paused by a window in a store. They were drawn to something in the reflection, not because they planned to shop. It wasn't someone else. It wasn't a thing. It was how they expressed themselves. They became aware for the first time in a long time that they had been harboring feelings they had never permitted themselves to admit. They were not depressed by that silent awareness. It piqued their interest. What if there were other paths waiting for them besides the one they had been on? And that question persisted longer than they had anticipated. As they made the decision to move forward, another unforeseen circumstance arose. A stranger grinned silently. Nearby, a child laughed. A well-known melody floated across the atmosphere from an unidentifiable source. On their own, none of those moments had much significance. When combined, though, they felt like real-time puzzle pieces coming together. Your soulmates slowed down. They just watched, not hurrying to the next duty. They became aware of hues they had previously disregarded. Even though the sky was still clear, they could smell the fresh rain on the breeze. Most significantly, they became aware that they were thinking about someone they had been unable to stop thinking about lately. It wasn't an overpowering sensation. It was certain and serene, as if their hearts had silently come to a decision before their minds could follow. The next dialogue starts with a common sentence and concludes by explaining why this day refused to be simply another afternoon, so pay close attention to this story. The most unexpected spot was where that conversation began. There was no elaborate setting, no meticulous planning, just two people having a straightforward conversation that at first seemed almost unmemorable. But beneath the surface, each word had an unexpected weight. The inquiry posed by the other individual was so informal that anyone else would have responded without hesitation. However, your soulmate was hesitant. More was said by that pause than by any speech. For what may have been the first time in weeks, they answered honestly, grinned, and briefly glanced off into the distance. Even they were taken aback by the response. It wasn't practiced. It wasn't flawless. It just originated from an actual place. Your soulmate stood silently in the afternoon light as the conversation came to an end and the other person left with a contemplative smile, realizing that something inside of them had changed irrevocably. They had no idea where this new assurance would take them. All they knew was that it would be impossible to pretend nothing had changed after today. One surprising revelation that explains why this typical afternoon turned into the start of a tale neither of you anticipated is waiting just ahead. Your soulmate was unable to ignore the quiet intensity of what transpired over the next few minutes. Every step they took felt different, as if the afternoon itself had slowed down to expose something that was concealed in between the everyday moments. They could not get the conversation they had just had out of their heads. In an attempt to understand why it felt so important, they repeated every phrase, pause, and emotion. Then an amazing event occurred. They saw a tiny park that they had passed many times before, but it appeared to be calling them to pause now. Unaware that someone else's life was changing just a few feet away, they sat on a nearby bench and watched people live their own stories. An old couple had a giggle at something that only they could comprehend. The trees were meticulously drawn by a teenage artist who seemed to be attempting to preserve a memory before it vanished. Everyone in the vicinity was reminded that happiness frequently comes without permission when a puppy ran happily over the grass. Your sweetheart finally revealed something they had been holding back for far too long in that serene setting. They didn't realize how every encounter had been preparing them for that moment since they had been so preoccupied with wondering if the appropriate person would come closer in the future. Parts of their past stopped feeling like haphazard chapters all of a sudden. They appeared to be connected, as though every setback, unforeseen hold-up, and unresolved query had subtly led them to this particular afternoon. Before we go any further, please leave a comment if this story has already caused you to think about a special person in your own life. Additionally, you should think about subscribing if you like stories that reveal life's unexpected turning points so you don't miss what comes next. Because everything you've heard thus far seems to be just the beginning of what your soulmate finds out in the coming moments. Your soulmate unknowingly discovered something they hadn't looked at in months when they reached into their pocket. It had no value in the traditional sense. They had nearly forgotten the existence of the little folded note. They gently opened it out of curiosity. A few straightforward words penned during an entirely different stage of life were contained therein. It felt very different to read those words now than it did then. The message did not make unrealistic promises or forecast the future. Rather, it served as a reminder that the person they want to be had always valued perseverance, development, and sincere communication. That misplaced note seemed to be a dialogue between their former selves and their current selves. They realized they had already gone far beyond what they had ever given themselves credit for, which caused a soft grin to appear on their faces, not because everything was suddenly great. Their phone vibrated at that moment. The message was not what they had anticipated. It actually came from somebody they hadn't spoken to in a long time. The words were succinct, reflective, and oddly timed. Today, you were on my mind. I hope all is okay with you. There was no pressure, no deep meaning, just kindness in that straightforward statement. However, it served as a reminder to your soulmate that unanticipated moments frequently come just when you need them. One aspect of this afternoon is still hidden, but once it emerges, you'll see why every seemingly insignificant detail has been subtly building to something truly remarkable. The sky faded into warm tones of amber and gold as the afternoon gradually gave way to early twilight, enveloping the city in a serenity that felt almost cinematic. Feeling lighter than they had just an hour before, your soulmate stood again. Something even more valuable had emerged, yet the answers they had been searching for weren't suddenly finished. A peaceful assurance that they no longer had to compel every result. They saw a familiar figure standing in the distance as they crossed the street. They briefly questioned whether it was just in their heads. The person gazed in the direction of your sweetheart after turning slightly and grinning at someone close. They didn't say anything. Neither of them hurried on. However, there was a sense that some stories don't start with big announcements in that quiet conversation. They start with timing and recognition. When two individuals unintentionally travel quite separate paths to reach the same emotional objective. The reason your soulmate's heartbeat felt slower rather than quicker was beyond explanation. All they knew was that this afternoon had turned into a pivotal moment they would never forget. However, what follows that quiet look? And a chapter that shifts the course of the narrative is about why someone ultimately chooses to disclose a fact they have been keeping hidden for a very long time. Once more, as your soulmate believed that the most significant moments had already passed, a silent awareness descended upon the evening. They continued walking for a short while before something subtly urged them to slow down once more. Everything around them carried on just as it had before. Bicycles riding by, people chatting on the neighboring sidewalks, lights starting to shine in storefront windows, all of it felt freshly alive within. That wordless glance from minutes before was all they could think about. They didn't think it promised anything exceptional. It was because it reawakened an emotion they had nearly forgotten. The clear's throat, bravery to be receptive to life's unforeseen turns. They then saw a small community gathering happening in a nearby square as they turned the corner of the street. The air was filled with gentle music. Families congregated around food vendors while artists showcased paintings that depicted ordinary moments of happiness. Your soulmate entered almost mindlessly. Something new emerged every few steps. A musician grinned while strangers cheered. A child displaying a handmade drawing to their parents with pride. A flower arrangement around the stage is being meticulously watered by an elderly woman. These scenes weren't created especially for your partner. However, they were all subtly reminded that lovely things frequently flourish in unexpected locations. Stay close because your soulmate's strange feelings from this afternoon will all come together in one memorable moment through an unexpected encounter inside this vibrant square. They stopped in front of a local photographer's display of unposed photos of common people experiencing extraordinary emotions as they investigated the event. There were only sincere expressions captured in time, no glitzy surroundings or well-known faces. Two friends who had been apart for years were seen laughing in one picture. Another featured a parent watching his daughter perform on a tiny stage with pride. However, your partner seemed more interested in one picture than the others. It depicted a lone person standing under an autumn tree, grinning toward a far-off horizon as if they had faith that something amazing was waiting just beyond their line of sight. When the photographer happened to pass by, he saw that they were interested. They thought nothing significant was going on that day, so they smiled warmly and stated, "Funny thing about this picture. The person didn't know I was taking it." Those straightforward words had a lasting effect. Suddenly, your sweetheart questioned how many significant chapters start without dramatic cues or ideal timing. the most significant changes might not even be apparent. Maybe they sneak into our lives as casual discussions, everyday afternoons, or unplanned pauses. They thanked the photographer and carried on walking, not realizing that someone else in the vicinity had silently noticed them, but that thought lingered. Not because they were famous, not because it was a coincidence, but because the moment they were spotted again, a long-forgotten memory came flooding back. The significance of that realization is much greater than anyone can imagine, as the following moments demonstrate. Footsteps came from behind just as the pavement began to reflect the first evening lights. Calm and not in a rush. Naturally, your soulmate turned, anticipating another typical exchange. Rather, they were confronted by a person whose expression was a mixture of quiet wonder and genuine warmth. "I almost didn't believe it was you," the person remarked, laughing softly. They started discussing a brief encounter that had occurred years before. One act of compassion that your lover had entirely forgotten made a brief yet amazing talk last only a few minutes. After hearing the tale, your sweetheart came to a profound realization. Even the tiniest decisions we make frequently have an impact on other people's lives long after we have stopped considering them. Someone had been inspired by that forgotten occasion during a trying time. And now, years later, it had unexpectedly reappeared as a reminder that generosity always left echoes that we seldom get to see. Your soulmate was overcome with the feeling that today had never been about chance alone as they stood there conversing under the gentle glow of the evening sky. They had learned something about themselves that they really needed to know thanks to each halt, unexpected stop, and silent choice. However, the most startling revelation was yet to materialize. Because one unexpected question will be posed to your soulmate before this day finally ends. Furthermore, the answer to that question will subtly alter the future in ways that neither of them could have predicted. Your soulmate practically answered the question without thinking because it came so naturally. However, the person's composed demeanor gave the impression that this wasn't your typical question. Would you choose comfort, or would you choose the path that truly feels right? They said quietly, if you had the chance to begin one meaningful chapter again. For a brief moment, the noises of the evening appeared to disappear. Your soulmate didn't answer right away. Rather, they gazed at the glowing lights, the families giggling together, and the serene cadence of a day that had become something truly remarkable. They came to the realization that they had lived too long under the belief that action could only be taken after assurance. However, they had learned the opposite in silence this afternoon. Sometimes taking the first courageous action is the first step toward clarity. Finally, they smiled gently and said, I'd choose what feels real, even if I don't know exactly where it leads. They nodded as if they had anticipated those exact words all along. Then you're already closer than you think, they said before turning to leave. Long after the conversation was over, those few words continued to reverberate in your soulmate's heart. Please feel free to share in the comments if this story reminded you of a significant occasion in your own life or made you think of someone. Additionally, subscribing is a great way to stay with us for the next chapter if you like stories that reveal life's subtle turning moments. Because one last surprise that nobody anticipated is set to be revealed this evening. Your lover made the decision to travel the long way home as dusk descended upon the city. They quickly realized the importance of slowing down, not because they were lost. There seemed to be details on every street that they had been ignoring for years. The apartment windows were illuminated by warm lights. Laughter from a rooftop cafe could be heard in the distance. The shimmering reflection of the sky on a silent fountain. In a way that words could hardly describe, everything felt interconnected. Then, outside a local bookshop, they saw a small community board. Its surface was covered in dozens of handwritten notes. A few were thank you notes. Others were aspirations people wanted to fulfill. Among all the notes, one straightforward one stuck out. It said, "Your soulmate," stood there reading those words repeatedly. They weren't magical. The people meant to change your life rarely arrive when you're searching. They appear when you've become ready to notice them. They weren't enigmatic. They were just straightforward, and somehow, in light of everything that had transpired this afternoon and evening, those few words had greater significance than they could have on any other day. They folded the thought into their hearts with a quiet smile, not realizing that another surprising part of this story was waiting just a few blocks away. Your soulmate's phone lit up again just before you got home. This time, it wasn't a routine reminder or a random notification. Instead, it was a message that had been carefully written, erased, rewritten, and finally sent after hours of hesitation. The words were straightforward: "I almost didn't reach out today, but something told me I shouldn't wait any longer. I hope you're grinning." Your soulmate looked up at the evening sky, took a deep breath, and realized that this afternoon had never been about a single dramatic event. They stared at the screen, not because the message addressed every question, but rather because it came at the precise moment when they had stopped expecting anything more from the day. As they unlocked their front door, they noticed one last surprise: a small envelope with their name written across the front in recognizable handwriting and no explanation resting neatly at the entrance. It had been about a series of quiet moments that gradually reshaped the way they saw themselves, the people around them, and the possibilities still waiting ahead. The envelope felt surprisingly light in your soulmate's hands, but somehow it carried the weight of countless unspoken thoughts. What was inside wasn't expensive or complicated, but by the time they finished reading it, they would understand why this ordinary afternoon had subtly turned into the start of an unforgettable new chapter. The hallway was quiet, the world seemed to wait with them as the last hues of the sunset faded into a serene evening glow outside, and they took their time opening it, almost fearing that rushing the moment would rob it of something special. They unfolded the neatly written letter inside slowly. It wasn't long. The writer acknowledged that they had nearly remained silent forever, believing that some feelings were safer left unsaid, but after everything they had seen that afternoon, they realized life has a peculiar way of reminding us that the right words lose their power if we wait too long to say them. Instead of being full of dramatic promises or impossible declarations, it spoke with a sincerity that instantly captured their heart. Your soulmate felt something subtly change inside as they read the letter, which thanked them for being the kind of person who made people feel seen, understood, and encouraged even in times when they were unaware they were making a difference. For so long, they had measured their life by the answers they still lacked. However, this letter served as a reminder that sometimes the biggest impact we make occurs in moments we are unaware of. Hold on to this thought until the very end, as the last page of the letter includes a single sentence that explains why this memorable afternoon could turn into the start of something neither of you anticipated. Your soulmate turned to the final page and saw that the handwriting had become a little slower, as if each word had been carefully chosen.